Hi everyone, I think we are now live. Boom, here we go. Hi everyone, and welcome to this mini webinar on Marcus Aurelius and anger. Please just take a moment to introduce yourself briefly in the comments section and say where you're from. And also just to let me know that you can hear me and see me okay. My name is Donald Robertson and I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist and writer. I'm very involved with Stoicism. I have been for many years, about 20 years now. And I'm the author of 5 books on philosophy and psychotherapy, 6 now actually, including Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, which is kind of a self-help book about Stoicism, and a couple of other ones here. The Philosophy of CBT, which is more about the history of ideas, the relationship between modern psychotherapy and Stoicism, and also this, which is a book about resilience, but it's actually mainly a discussion of, it's a self-help book about the relationship between modern third wave psychotherapy and Stoicism. So that's a little bit about who I am. I also run the Stoic Week and Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience training courses for Modern Stoicism, which is a non-profit organisation that teaches people about Stoic philosophy. And I've just finished writing a new book as well about the life and the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. So this is an area that I've kind of been pretty immersed in for about the last year or so, really. And I also run an online course about Marcus Aurelius and his use of Stoicism. That's called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and it's actually enrolling at the moment. If you're interested, I've posted a link in the comments thread for anybody that's interested in taking a look at that course. It starts in about a week's time. Today's webinar is, as I mentioned a moment ago, about anger. And I think I should take around about 15 minutes. And if you post any questions that you have in the comments thread, then I will endeavour to answer those at the end of the session today. So that's where I'm going to go now, and just have a quick look and check that some people are arriving. Usually on these Facebook things I find a lot of people watch the video afterwards, but I'll see if we're getting some comments yet, because that's always good to know that the audio's working and stuff. Hi, Fort Worth, Texas. Oh, somebody from England, cool. Okay, so, we're working. Right, Facebook is working for us. So let's dive right in then. I won't keep you too long today. I do tend to go on a little bit sometimes. And I wanted to start with a couple of little stories. That's really my main interest at the moment. Actually, in the book that I've just written, in the course that I'm running, my interest, and this really comes from teaching philosophy to my daughter, Poppy, who's 6, is kind of in how we can take anecdotes about famous philosophers, particularly ancient philosophy, and learn from them. And I find it's just kind of more fun, and it tends to particularly give us a very different perspective in Stoicism, because when we look at examples of real people from history who embraced Stoicism, I feel that it does what I would describe as puts a human face on Stoicism, and it tends to portray it in a way that actually addresses some of the most common misconceptions or objections against Stoicism. So let's start with just a kind of sample of 2 little stories about Marcus Aurelius. The first one is more about Marcus's adoptive grandfather, the Emperor Hadrian. And it said Marcus grew up under the gaze of Hadrian. Hadrian picked him out at a very early age to succeed him as a future emperor. Hadrian was succeeded by the Emperor Antoninus, and then in turn Marcus succeeded Antoninus. But seemingly that was part of a big long-term succession plan that Hadrian had already worked out. Now, Hadrian was an odd man. He was a real polymath. He had a very active mind. He was a very active man, but he also had quite volatile moods. And it said he once lost his temper with a slave and stabbed a guy in the eye with a metal stylus, which is what the Romans used to write at the time. So in this fit of temper, he stabbed somebody in the eye, a slave. And presumably people watching this at court were horrified. I mean, emperors did pretty crazy things, but I think this was shocking to the people that witnessed it. And Hadrian was, I would have Hadrian down as basically quite a pretentious guy. He was always desperate to show off his learning. He got in a lot of pretentious arguments with people. He wanted to appear cultured, respectable, moral, sophisticated. He wanted praise and admiration from people. It's interesting the way that Epictetus and Marcus kind of talk about trying to avoid becoming like that. So when he eventually calmed down, he realised what he'd done, and he asked the slave if there was anything that he could do to make it up to him. And of course the man replied, "All I really want is my eye back. Thanks very much." But of course that was the one thing that even Hadrian couldn't give him. And the moral of the story is that sometimes in anger we do things that are permanently damaging. We do irreparable damage. And that's why anger is an emotion not to be trifled with. Perhaps in more subtle ways as well in life, we can damage relationships, damage our career. We can affect things in a way that it's not easy just to rectify the next day. Marcus may have known this story. I think it comes from his physician Galen. Even if he didn't know it, he would certainly have known many other stories about Hadrian. He knew him in person. A curious aside about that, Marcus, in book 1 of the Meditations, lists 16 people, if I remember rightly, whose virtues he admires, and the one who stands out the most is his adoptive father, the Emperor Antoninus Pius, but Hadrian isn't mentioned anywhere in that part of the Meditations, although he does kind of crop in later. Marcus mentions him in a fairly kind of indifferent way. He mentions him in passing. That would have really offended Hadrian if he'd lived to see it. But it's like Marcus doesn't have anything to praise about Hadrian, interestingly. Now, story number 2. Marcus himself was known for being very calm and not reacting to provocation. Unlike Hadrian, he wasn't quick-tempered. And there's a story that probably towards the end of his life, we don't know exactly when it's set, but Marcus, part of his role as emperor was to preside as a judge in court in legal cases. And there was one between a famous billionaire philanthropist and a family friend of Marcus called Hebrides Atticus and the people of Athens, who were always kind of at each other's throats. And Herodes was also a terrible man. He was alleged to have kicked his pregnant wife to death. He wasn't a pleasant character by all accounts. And in this little courtroom drama, Herodes got more and more frustrated with Marcus because he wasn't taking his side, and Herodes felt that Marcus owed him a favour because years earlier, over a decade earlier I think, Marcus's brother Lucius Verus had been put up by Herodes, perhaps at great expense, and he was kind of bitter about that. So he started berating Marcus about it. He said, I did you this favour, I put up your brother, and I went out of my way to do that, and you kind of owe me a favour, in the middle of the court. And then at one point he lunged towards Marcus in a threatening manner, and the situation kind of exploded very rapidly. The Praetorian prefect who was there, Marcus's guard, drew his sword and was about to cut this guy down in his tracks when Marcus very quickly signalled for him to stand down and defused the situation, and he rose from his chair calmly, and he said something very peculiar. He said, "An old man fears little," and then he adjourned the hearing, and he walked out of the courtroom without reacting or losing his temper. He kept his cool. And I think what he meant by that was that someone who's come to terms with his own mortality fears very little. That's what I kind of imagine he may have meant by that remark. But in any case, it's an example of Marcus keeping calm in the face of provocation and actually defusing a situation that almost turned very nasty. And how different he seems there from the story about Hadrian with the stylus. And he mentions an old man fears little. Again, as an aside, the Stoics often believed or the Stoics believed that often anger was the result of fear, and that if we addressed the underlying fear, that was a way of defusing the anger. Now, it might come as a surprise to you to know that Marcus wasn't naturally free from anger, although he kind of contrasts with Hadrian in this respect. He had problems at first controlling his temper. How do we know that? Well, because he says so in the Meditations. And he talks in particular about the problems that he had controlling his anger towards his Stoic mentor, Junius Rusticus. And he says he nearly lost his temper with him a number of times. And he was thankful, though, for never having done anything that he might have regretted. Again, this reminds us of Hadrian doing this terrible thing that he regretted the next day but couldn't reverse. And in addition to that, it's worth noticing that the Meditations opens, Book 1 begins, with Marcus talking about his real grandfather, his natural grandfather, who was called Marcus Aurelius Verus. And Marcus praises this man for being gentle and free from anger, and that's what he learned from him. He was brought up by him to some extent. And how this contrasts with Hadrian, his adoptive grandfather's notoriously bad temper. And in fact, Marcus talks a lot about anger in the Meditations. It's actually one of the main themes of the whole book. The Stoics in general are very interested with anger. Seneca, as you may know, we have surviving today an entire book by Seneca called On Anger. But Marcus talks many times about anger, and he says things that are similar to Seneca but a little bit different. So there's a lot actually we can extract from both of those Stoics about Stoic therapy for anger. There's a passage in the Meditations in particular where Marcus describes what he calls 10 gifts from Apollo and his muses, which is an interesting way of putting it because Apollo was the god of medicine or therapy. So these are 10 remedies or psychological therapies, gifts from the god of healing. Now, I'm not going to go over all of those today, but just to let you know, we're kind of just scratching the surface here. We're just picking a couple of techniques. We're going to pick 3 of those 10 techniques, and I just want to say a little bit about them to give you a flavour of some of the psychological techniques that the Stoics talk about. And the first one I'm going to talk about actually is a bit of a tricky one, but it's not necessarily the one that would appeal most to modern readers, I think, but it's the one that Marcus places most emphasis upon, and it is one that he returns to a number of times. He tends to list it first when he describes strategies for coping with anger, and that is the strategy of reminding ourselves that humans are fundamentally social creatures. And this is employed as a psychological technique, a strategy by Marcus in response to feelings of anger. So the Stoics believed, as you probably know, that humans are inherently rational creatures. It's one of the most distinctive things about us, and that's important to how we understand our obligation to ourselves for Stoics. It's kind of the basis of Stoic ethics. Because we're rational, we have an obligation to live rationally, to perfect reason, and to attain wisdom. But the Stoics also say that we are fundamentally social creatures. They often compare human beings to bees or ants in that respect. And they believe, therefore, that we have an obligation to develop this social dimension, to develop virtues in the social sphere. And humans don't normally live in isolation. Reason itself, they would say, is social. We need a community to develop a language, for example. And the Stoics believe that to excel as a human being, we have to not only be wise, but also excel in terms of our relationships with other people. And this interpersonal, social dimension of Stoicism is something that's often, I think, completely ignored by people today when they're commenting on Stoic philosophy. But it's hard to miss in Marcus Aurelius in particular, because he emphasises it more than most other Stoics, and he certainly emphasises it more than Epictetus, and it's on virtually every other page of the Meditations that he talks about man being a social creature. He talks about cosmopolitanism, he he talks about natural affection, he talks about these interpersonal or social virtues, not just justice, but also he particularly talks about the virtue of beneficence or kindness towards other people. So we have to learn to live wisely among others, Marcus would say. We are social creatures. Nature has made us this way. If we are going to fulfill our potential, then we have to not only become wise, but become good at relating to other people. We have a kind of duty to deal well with other people, to deal wisely with other people. And Marcus thinks that reminding ourselves of that is very important when somebody's provoking or upsetting us. And so Marcus would say anger obviously isn't a virtue in that regard. So we should ask ourselves what it would mean to deal well with people, if not being angry with them. Then what would the alternative be? What would virtue look like in this situation? And actually he often frames that in terms of a particular concept of kindness. So that's the first strategy he talks about, and the one that seems most important to him. And the second one he talks about is the one that I think is most relatable to modern readers, which I call Stoic catharsis. And it resembles a technique in modern cognitive therapy. It's particularly central to third wave CBT, or mindfulness and acceptance-based CBT, and it's called cognitive distancing or verbal defusion by psychologists today. And if you don't know what that is, it's captured very well in a very famous quotation from Epictetus, who said, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things." Now Marcus applies that to a number of specific problems. He adapts it to different areas of life. It's obviously an important strategy to him. It's obviously central to Epictetus' teachings. And in relation to anger, Marcus says, look, it's not people who make us angry, but our judgments about them. And specifically our judgments that they're bad, or that they're threatening to, or that they have harmed us in some way. And so it's important to him, as it was to Epictetus, to challenge these judgments. Now you might say it's true that people are bad and that they do threaten to do us harm, or they do us harm. But Marcus and the Stoics would disagree with that. It's a cornerstone of Stoic philosophy that nothing external to our mind can be absolutely good or bad in the strong sense of the word. So we need to know a little bit about Stoic ethics to really understand what they mean by that. Of course, the Stoics disapprove of vices and they praise virtues in other people. They do judge external things according to value, or axia as they put it, but they don't judge them to be absolutely good or absolutely bad in this peculiar strong sense that they're particularly concerned with. Or to put it very crudely, they're not worth getting upset about. We shouldn't care so strongly about other people's vices that we get upset by them. So the Stoics believe, on the basis of their ethics, we should question this idea that other people have harmed us, or that they can harm us, because they can't harm our character, the Stoics would say, and that's the most important thing in life, unless ironically we allow them to do so. What they do isn't good or bad for us unless we judge it to be so, they might say. Now, the third technique I want to mention is another one that people often don't talk about, but it's there described repeatedly in a number of different ways in Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. It doesn't really have a name, but I tend to, over the years, I've just got into the habit of labelling these techniques, sometimes using names from the Stoic literature, and sometimes just using names that are common in modern therapy. And this one I would call Stoic functional analysis. It's a kind of simplistic form of what we would call functional analysis in psychotherapy. And Stoics love using this. And what they do, it's similar to the myth of Hercules, or the allegory of Hercules that's known as the famous choice of Hercules. It's attributed to the sophist Prodicus, incidentally, if you want to go and look that up. I've got a picture of Hercules on the wall behind me, I don't know if you can see that. So in this story, Hercules, as a young man, finds himself standing at a fork in the road, And Stoic functional analysis is kind of like this. It involves imagining that a dichotomy. The Stoics love using these dichotomies, by the way. They occur in many different forms as a psychological strategy. So the Stoics say, look, just imagine you've basically got two options. Like, let's keep things simple. Think of it in terms of two options. Either you go down the road of passion or you go down the road of reason. Like, and think of that as the decision that you have to make in life. In this case, following the passion of anger. And the Stoics say, well, what would the consequences of that be? Picture yourself days, weeks, months from now, if you allow yourself to be swept along with anger, and envisage how that would affect you and other people. Epictetus tells his students, think about the way that you might end up regretting it, and picture the consequences. Basically, where does it get you? In therapy, we often just ask, how's that working out for you? What would happen if you did that every day? Very simple questions that get people to project themselves into the future. You could call it a kind of time projection technique. And on the other path, what would happen if you acted wisely or virtuously, if you followed reason rather than irrational passions? And contrasting these two paths, and we imagine them as two diverging paths because, of course, as time goes on, where the consequences will tend to drift further and further apart the further we pursue them into the future. So this is another technique that Marcus often talks about, imagining where anger is actually going to get you. What's going to happen if you allow yourself to be swept along with these feelings of anger? Now, I should introduce, there are a number of very fundamental Stoic ideas that it's essential for people to understand in order to grasp these techniques. So we've only got a short space of time today. I'm kind of assuming some background knowledge about Stoicism, but I should say that the Stoics make an important distinction between feelings that are involuntary and feelings that are under our control. And the involuntary feelings they call proto-passions, or first movements of passion or emotion, or they're called propathei in Greek, and they're indifferent. We should view those, we're told, as inevitable, as natural, and they're not bad. We shouldn't see them as harmful. We shouldn't fight against them. As Stoics, we should accept them with indifference, and that would extend to certain feelings of anger. So Seneca talks about these initial feelings of anger, and the Stoics, I think, would say that these are kind of reflex-like emotional reactions that you could view as being similar to those that we would share with other animals. So they're kind of animalistic, physiological, reflex-like reactions that you might have. If somebody comes along and punches you in the face, you're probably going to be frightened and angry as your initial reaction. But then you have control over what happens next in response to that initial emotional reaction. Do you agree with what it seems to be telling you? Do you go along with it and allow it to guide your thinking? Or do you kind of take a step back from it, gain cognitive distance, tell yourself, look, it's not the other person that's upsetting me, it's my judgment that something bad or harmful has happened that's upsetting me, and that's under my control. I can suspend that judgment, I can reverse it, I can take a step back from it. We call that's similar to what we call taking a time-out strategy in modern anger management as well. So the Stoics talk a lot about this idea of postponing responding to passions, and they were aware that if we give our emotions time, they'll tend to abate or calm down naturally, and then we can think more rationally, and we can start to question the nature of our response. Is it a healthy or an unhealthy response? What would the consequences of it be? So those are just 3 of the 10 gifts from Apollo, the god of healing, that Marcus mentions. There's a lot more about anger aside from that, even just in the meditations. So how do you cope with anger? I wanted to ask that because actually I've been teaching anger management for many years, but I always like just to ask people what strategies they already use to cope with anger. And then I find that most of the things that people come up with, we can find are already in the repertoire, in the armamentarium of therapy or Stoicism. And it's useful because it serves a validating purpose. It amplifies, it adds something to people's existing strategies. If you can say, hey, did you realize that this approach that you already use that's maybe working for you, Marcus Aurelius mentions doing something similar, and making that connection can help validate people, add another dimension to strategies that they're already using. So do let me know about strategies that you already use to cope with anger, or ones that you're interested in, and I'll try and respond to any comments that you post under this video. Like I said, sometimes people watch the replay afterwards, so they may be commenting. Sometimes I get comments on videos, you know, months later, but if I get notified, I'll try and respond to them, and we can have a little bit more of a conversation about the practicalities of anger management, and you know, the real life use of Stoicism, how you personally are using these ideas, or how you might be using them. So thank you everyone for coming along and putting up with me for another 15 minutes or whatever it's been, probably longer than that. I look forward to seeing some of you in the course, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. If you're interested in enrolling, by the way, there's currently a $50 discount off the normal price if you register now. And you also get 3 ebooks free when you enroll in the course. Books about Marcus Aurelius, his life, and also a copy of the meditations, so you might be interested in that as well. So once again, it's goodbye from me here in Nova Scotia, and I'll finish my coffee, have a little break, and then I'll have a look at your comments. Goodbye.